My name is Nick Wilmore, and welcome to my latest session on plagiarism, or as I prefer to call it, good academic practice. Plagiarism is a significant issue across academia. That it is something that we talk about quite a bit, we warn students about, but I think often we're not very good at explaining what it is and why it is that plagiarism is an issue. We recognise that it is very rare that students try and deceive, that often where there are issues it is more about poor practice rather than any sort of malicious intent. I think in terms of managing your work, if you follow the rules around identifying quotes and follow good referencing practice, which I've already underlined in my other session around referencing, that you will be able to steer the rocky path to getting a good assignment together. Part of it is actually thinking about whether you even need a quote. Instead, could you try and summarise? One of the things that I'm very aware of is that when we try and summarise, we can often use less words than was originally intended by the initial author. And when you're working to a limited word count, any savings are worth having. Ultimately, when we're looking at plagiarism though, it is a judgment call. And the judgment is around, is this poor practice or is it an attempt to deceive? But either way, both have their implications. So let's move on and let's look at some of the detail. Why does plagiarism matter? So why does plagiarism matter? I think there are, for me, three key aspects as to what is going on here. One of them is about being transparent as to what is your work and what comes from others. Ultimately, we all want to be judged on what we've done, and it's important for others to be able to recognise our contribution and where we have reached in our studies. It's partly about demonstrating that you have developed your thinking and that that development has been based on good foundations. And finally, it's about showing how you have created new perspectives on a concept that you are extending your understanding and possibly the wider discussion. So what we're demonstrating here through good academic practice is actually where you are, what you think, and how you can help others in terms of their thinking around your discussion, around your subject. So it is worth being sure that where you are drawing on others, you're being clear, and where you are contributing, that can be understood. Okay, so what is plagiarism? Okay, so plagiarism. What is it? Well, as it says here, it's a spectrum of issues. It can range anything from poor referencing to an intent to portray another person's work as your own. So when I say it's a spectrum, I really do mean it can be anything from forgetting to put all the details of a quote at the end, or possibly to include all the quotation marks that you might use in the sentence, right up to using chunks of other people's work in one of your assignments. So the worst case of plagiarism I've heard about was a young man who was doing a piece of work as part of his GCSE, didn't fully understand the material that he was taught in class, so copied over chunks of Wikipedia into his school assignment. Needless to say, it was spotted, the source was identified, and it was dealt with. In academic terms, plagiarism is a serious conduct issue, in that it could imply a lack of integrity if you're trying to portray another person's work as your own, or it could indicate a lack of either carefulness in terms of how you write and present your material, or a lack of understanding of what the appropriate guidelines are. And there would then be the question of, well, why don't you understand them? So whichever way you look at it, it is considered a serious conduct issue. Right, so the next question is, how do we spot it? And I have to admit at this stage that it isn't a result of any form of divine inspiration. It's not a magic art. It's actually from really two things that are inherent in the university system. So the first one is the infamous Turnitin or other electronic system that compares a wide range of existing texts against yours. So it's a word matching, sentence matching system. They are typically based on a wide range of books and articles, although it doesn't include every book and article because that is just far too big. But it does bring quite a spectrum of different sources together. They can be incredibly precise, but they will spot sections with occasional changes. And by that I mean that most will recognise two halves of a sentence and the fact you've changed three words in the middle. When I say they're very precise, I had an experience quite recently where a student wrote about aspects of discrimination, and it was identified as being exactly the same as in a written article. The thing was, the written article was about Cambodian road safety, and that student would not have read that, and when I checked with him, he didn't even know there existed such a thing. And thereby hangs the devil of these electronic systems, is that they can sometimes bring up quite a lot of what I would call noise. So it's short phrases or ideas that may well have been printed by someone else, but where they're either commonly used phrases or it's just sheer chance. And thereby hangs why you cannot just rely on any electronic matching system. My guess is, if I was to ask this question in 15 years' time, there would be some sort of AI interface that will do the work. But at this moment in time, it's down to your poor humble tutor. The other bit, and this now comes into where the tutor has an experience and a role, is that we recognise styles. And that's in two parts. We recognise your style, your approach, your words, and suddenly we see something coming out that doesn't look like it's anything like what you might have said or fits with what you've previously written, either in this assignment or previous ones, and it just jars. And I'm sure if you read an article in The Sun and you read the same article written in the Times, you would immediately spot the difference. There is just a difference in style, despite the fact that they share the same journalists. What we're talking about here is way of writing, and we recognise it. We're also familiar with a lot of the key text you're going to be reading. Let's not beat about the bush. You're not our first students. We will have looked at the course material, we would have looked at a lot of the key books on the subject, and probably would have looked at some of the more obscure articles on this subject provided by previous students. So this is where your colleagues might want to dob you in. So we have some familiarity with the reading list. We will also look at your reading list. And if there's anything in there that stands out as something I haven't seen before, I'm going to have a quick look, because you may well have found a little nugget there. So that might be useful to me in my future teaching, but it also means I've just read it, so if you're going to be quoting chunks out of it without attributing it, I'm likely to notice. So there are a number of issues in terms of spotting it about electronic systems, our familiarity as tutors with texts, with your work, and just spotting where things just don't fit. All of this is subjective, absolutely, but what I would do is I would prefer to describe that as an informed professional decision on the basis that, yes, we've been here before. Some are better at it than others, some are more literal than others. As I said in the introduction, and we will come back to in a minute, the key thing is what's happened and why. Okay, so we've looked at what plagiarism is. I've spoken briefly about how tutors might spot plagiarism, but the real issue is, how do I avoid it? Because ultimately as students, that's going to be your priority. What I would say is that in the first instance, summarise rather than quote. So use your own words as much as possible. You need to follow the university convention for identifying quotes. That can really vary quite a bit, so it is worth just checking with your library what is expected. I'm going to go on and show a few examples of how I might do it, but they're not golden rules. Indeed, Birmingham University, when I was there in the mid 2010s, did not have a specific convention. What they said was, be clear and be consistent in the way that you approach it. I would, however, suggest you use quotation marks, and placing the page or location details at the end of the quote is essential. I will go and show you a few examples in a minute, but the idea around the page or location details is absolutely critical, because when you put this sort of material through the likes of Turnitin, it is looking for the P and a number at the end, and if it's not there, it will flag it up. Okay, the examiner, let's say the examiner or the academic conduct officer, will be looking at it and will take a reasoned view, but the page is having the page there is the convention that will keep you safe. So, having worried you about the detail of plagiarism, let's actually look at what does good look like, because as I said at the beginning, I prefer to think of this as what is good academic practice, and to fix that in your mind rather than worry you about what does plagiarism look like. So the next couple of slides are going to look at some examples of how to keep yourself safe by writing in a manner that is good. Okay, so the first part of what does good look like are the bits that I suspect many of you are already well aware of, that quotations are clearly identified within parentheses, followed by the reference. So in this case I've invented one, which is Alan 2020, but the key thing here is that you're also putting the page number, and that's showing that's helping the reader quickly move to where you took the quotation from. The importance of this from the reader's perspective is if they're unsure of the context from which you took your quote, they can go back to that article or book very quickly and confirm that you are using it in the way that the original author intended. So, as I've talked about with referencing, a lot of this is about how you help the reader understand that your ideas are based on what other people have put together and have a strong foundation. Now, the second version you can see here is again where you might be wanting to quote somebody within part of a sentence. So here, Alan, and again you're giving the date so that the reader can quickly work out from your reading list who you're talking about and where to find that article. So Alan said that, again the quotation clearly identified within parentheses, but this time the page number is at the end of the quotation, it's not within the reference. And as I said earlier, in part that is to ensure that when this comes out in Turnitin as having been bought from somewhere else, the person looking at the Turnitin report can immediately see that you knew this was a quote and you have identified where it came from. So it's about good practice, and it's about making sure that the reader and the examiner understand what you've thought, where you've brought it from, and that you are clearly attributing it. So we've looked at how we might take a quote within a typical article where you are only looking at a sentence or part of a sentence. You may also be looking at taking a bigger chunk, and on this occasion I've chosen to take one from an electronic source. You may notice that because it's a longer quotation, I've indented it. So it's still got the parentheses at the beginning and end, but I've indented it so that it stands out clearly from my work as being that of somebody else's. At the end, again, like any other reference, I've started off with Baswa. I then went to 2014. Because it's from an electronic source, there is no page number. So what I've done is I've opted to use the section heading that this came from, which in this case was introduction. So let's go to that electronic source that I've just been talking about, and what I'm showing you now is a screenshot of the page that came from. So you can see it was from the Code of Ethics for Social Work. You can see that it was October 2014, so they were the two things in my reference brackets, and then you can see it says introduction, which is how I identified my location, and immediately below that you can see the sentence that I was quoting. So it's not significantly different to how you might reference a book or a journal article. It's about showing the reader how they can quickly find the element that you have quoted in your work. Okay, so this slide is really just a little bit of revision from the session that I did on referencing. You are going to want to support your argument using a range of different sources, and it's just a reminder really that where you are summarising somebody and including them in your discussion, you might want to be saying, as I have here, Glasby and Littlechild in their discussion of direct payments said that. So you're using them to support the argument you're making, and you're using their title, the title that they have published under, which in this occasion was Glasby and Littlechild, although John Glasby and Rosemary Littlechild will publish independently of each other as well, and the date in which that article was written, or in this occasion a book. The second way of supporting it would be a full summary of what you might want to be discussing. So on this occasion, I've taken a summary of a piece of an article by Zambrano Montserrat and a range of others. So you can see two different approaches. One of them, you have the name and the date together. The other, where you're actually saying these are the people that actually said it, you might want to just put the date in as a way of linking it to the reference that's in your reading list. Here is the original clip from Zambrano and Montserrat in italics and my summary on the right hand side, and you can immediately see that whilst my summary is of about 20 to 25 words over 4 lines, theirs is over 8 or 9 lines and is more like 50 words, and thereby hangs one of the gains of summarising a source, is that in doing so you may well use less words and demonstrate an understanding of what's wanted, and also potentially screening out parts of their discussion that actually are not relevant to what you're wanting to say. So the benefits of summarising, but what I would say, as always, is make sure it does look different. Okay, so having talked about how we might use quotes and how we might summarise a source, let me think about what some of the issues are. Obviously, one of them, and I've introduced this earlier, was the concept of insufficient changes to the original text. That just changing a couple of words in a couple of sentences ain't gonna cut it, guys. Certainly, if you look at the slide before that I've just talked about, my summary is about half the number of words of the original, and that can make quite a difference if your university has opted to include quotes as part of your word count, because suddenly what you're doing is you're introducing 25 words of your own which can be assessed instead of 50 words of another author's which is not going to be assessed. You can very quickly see that that does make a difference. So quotes can be good, but they can also be a problem. You need to think about your university policy on word lengths, because as I say, some include, some don't. If they don't, okay, it's a free dinner and it can be quite useful. But if your university does include quotes in the word length, then using on a 3,000 or 4,000 word assignment, using a dozen quotes can easily use up 300 or 400 words, and suddenly 10% of your word count is of other people's work. So it doesn't contribute to the assessment of your work and your capability. That suddenly leaves you working on a much smaller amount of your own work to be assessed, and inevitably is going to give you less of a mark at the end. Therefore, avoid lengthy quotes and try and summarise wherever possible. What's more, if you're doing that, try and bring several authors together in that summary, and thereby give you additional credit in terms of the critical analysis aspect of the assessment of your work. So, there can be multiple gains here. So from my perspective, quotes are great where they're showing the spread of your reading, but don't overuse them, because they can then reduce your ability to show the breadth of your thinking. At the beginning, one of the things I said was that often there's no intention to deceive, by the student that is often an issue around management and confidence in understanding the rules around referencing and summarising. What I would say to you in terms of looking at what is good academic practice, the first one, and I'm sure every tutor will say this to you right from the beginning, is organise your work. That when you are hurrying, when you are trying to do things to the deadline that you didn't quite leave enough time for, that's when mistakes are made. And that's often what students tell me when they're referred for academic conduct issues. There are some ways of actually helping yourself, and these are some of the ideas that I've put together based on my own experience. One of the things I realised when I was writing my thesis is that you have a huge amount of quotes and additional ideas that you want to be referring to. What I did was I pasted all of those into a separate document. So as I was reading articles and books, I was cutting and pasting ideas into my quotes document. My quotes document ended up being many thousands of words. And what that shows is that you will often get ideas, you will often find things are interesting, and they will often then end up on the cutting room floor. And that is the normal process of academic filtering. But what you've got to do is make sure that you're organising all of that as you go along. So one of the things I do is that my quotes document has a different type font to that of my main document, so that when I transfer any quotes into my main document, they immediately stand out because they're either in a different colour or a different font. The point being that by putting them in and making them stand out, I know that they are quotes. I'm not going to forget and think they're a bit of mine and then not put in the proper referencing. That I leave them in that different font until I'm doing the final edit. When I check each quote, and of course that's easy to do now because they're standing out, because they're different, and once I'm satisfied with the presentation and I'm satisfied with the referencing, only then do I convert it to the same font as the rest of the main document. So all the way through, I'm ensuring myself against trying to rush through and missing bits. The other bit, you may have gathered me saying I had many thousands of words of quotes, is that I then sat down with my plan and looked at what I was putting in each section and how the different sources contributed to that. And the idea of that is to ensure that I've got a reasonable amount of evidence across the assignment, but also that I don't overload one section with too many quotes and then don't make the arguments that I wanted to make for myself. So it's balancing all the time this need to have others supporting what I'm saying whilst giving myself space to provide my own insight, my own analysis, which is what ultimately I'm going to be assessed on. So if you're coming to the end of this session, let's just have a little quick look back over some of the points that have been made. And I've entitled this Don't Panic, because actually panic is not the friend of academic writing. What you're trying to do is put over a calm, reasoned argument, and you cannot do that when you're panicking. Plagiarism is not that much of an issue if you're organised and if you're clear what you're trying to achieve. Ultimately, very few students actually set out to deceive. Normally, what we see is poor organisation. So manage your time so you're not rushing to finish. And I'm sure every tutor since Socrates has said this, and I'm sure every tutor in the future will also be saying so. It's the inevitable element of studentism, and I'm as guilty as everybody. But ultimately, rushing is not helpful. Do ask a friend to read your work and spot issues. That friend does not need to know a thing about your subject. It's almost better that they don't, because actually what you may find is that them asking questions because they don't follow your argument helps you clarify what you're trying to say. Obviously you want somebody who has some understanding of the academic world so they can spot some of the issues. But that doesn't have to be hugely detailed. I spoke to a student who had got into trouble around referencing, who said that she thought she'd done a good assignment until she showed it to her daughter, who was a second-year undergrad, who said, "Mum, you're an embarrassment. Don't you know you have broken all the rules?" And the mum said, "No, not until my tutor spoke to me." It doesn't need to be somebody who has any expert knowledge. It's somebody who can read it critically. If you haven't got that, one of the things we always used to do when I was working for the Audit Commission was we used to have a rule that said, when you finished a report, put it to one side, and then the next day, assuming you've got a next day, pick it up and go back through it. Often, if you just try and reread it straight away, you will miss the things that you missed when you first wrote it. You need fresh eyes. You need to be able to just go through and check that those quotes and references do meet the university standard. Read the assignment slowly and check that it is all yours. This is your final piece where you've just got to read it through slowly and be sure that you're comfortable. Ultimately, even if you're rushing the assignment, don't rush the final edit, because actually you'd be surprised how often in doing that final edit you can spot things that aren't reading right. You can spot opportunities to say something a bit better than what you've already got. It is worth the extra marks. So this brings us to the end of the discussion around good academic practice or plagiarism and all that sails within. I hope this has given you a bit more confidence to recognise when it is that you need to quote, that actually there may well be alternatives to it, and ultimately how a quote should be displayed. I think I'm hoping I've encouraged you to take that extra step and put some of your thinking into your assignments rather than that of other people's. It's difficult to start with, can be a bit scary, but what I would say to you is it gets respected by your tutors, and showing that you have based your thinking and your understanding on a good range of sources really does count, and it's well worth doing. So thank you ever so much for listening. Do listen to some of the other sessions that I'm putting up online, and I hope ultimately you'll subscribe and hear about future sessions that I'm going to be putting up, some of them on skills and some of them around the foundations for our work as social workers and as academics. So thank you ever so much for listening. Goodbye.